Welcome to Wilmington, North Carolina. 1898. A town alive with the rhythms of everyday life markets, bustling children's laughter echoing down red brick streets. Yet beneath the hum of commerce, a shadow gathered, an unseen tide of tension that would sweep through the black community like a phantom wind. In the early hours of November, whispers filled the air. Newspapers carried the words, race, riot, insurrection. Yet no one dared speak the truth aloud. Alex Manley, editor of the Wilmington Daily Record, read his own headlines, trembling. Fate unknown, the words seemed to leap from the page as though the ink itself mourned what was to come. They say that on that night, lanterns flickered across the streets, casting long, trembling shadows on wooden porches. The smell of burning timber drifted down the alleys. It was the smell of homes, businesses, and dreams being devoured. Fact, Layer official reports later described a mob action body's uncounted property destroyed a community, left in ash and silence. Folklore whispers carried in WPA interviews decades later told of spirits wandering the ruins, crying out for justice. Voices of the vanished moving between worlds, still marching through Wilmington's empty streets. Children who had fallen asleep to the lullabies of their mothers woke to the distant crackle of flames, shadows moving like hunters across the thresholds of their homes. Neighbors disappearing into the night, some never to return. Fact Layer, Freedmen's Bureau records later hinted at families fleeing their names, unknown, their fates unrecorded. Folklore. Layer elders spoke of lanterns floating in the river, guiding lost souls to safety, or perhaps deeper into the darkness. Before we begin this journey, leave a comment where you're listening from, what time it is where you are. Imagine the streets of Wilmington as they were, alive, breathing, then silenced. Let yourself feel the echoes of a town they tried to erase, the echoes that still linger, waiting, watching, whispering through the archives. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The church bell no longer rang. The marketplace emptied stalls, abandoned wares scattered in the dirt. Fact Layer eyewitness accounts described a sudden evacuation, families carrying what they could, leaving everything else behind. Folklore whispers some claimed that at midnight, the spirits of those lost returned to collect what was owed, circling the corners of the streets where once they had danced. Alex Manley's office, once a hub of words and debate, stood as a monument to resilience and fear. The printing press, quiet ink, still wet on pages that would never reach their audience. Fact Layer, contemporary newspapers outside Wilmington barely mentioned the events. Reports minimized sanitized riot instead of massacre. Folklore. The children later spoke of shadows that moved without bodies, a wind carrying voices of the displaced warning future generations. And as the first light of dawn struggled through smoke and haze, Wilmington lay transformed. A community fractured, a history in peril. Fact, Layer official property records later showed lost homes, lost businesses, names crossed out, unknown heirs. Folklore, local legend whispered of lanterns that could still be seen on foggy nights, dancing along the river, guiding lost souls, or perhaps marking the passage of time where memory refuses to fade. This is the town they tried to erase. Yet the echoes remain. Echoes that would reach far beyond 1898. Voices waiting to be heard, stories waiting to be told, shadows that will not rest. November 1898. Wilmington, North Carolina. A town perched on the edge of history and inevitability. A city of contrasts where cobblestone streets gleamed in the morning sun. And yet behind every doorway, a tension simmered. Ships drifted along the Cape Fear River, their sails catching the pale autumn light. The scent of salt water mixed with smoke from the city's chimneys drifting lazily through neighborhoods. Fishermen calling to one another, children running barefoot through alleys, merchants shouting prices in the market. Fact Layer Wilmington at this time was one of the few majority black cities in the South with thriving businesses, schools, and newspapers like the Wilmington Daily Record, which served as the heartbeat of the community. Folklore layer elders whispered of spirits guarding the streets, watching over families as they moved about their daily lives. The air carried a strange mixture of prosperity and unease. The distant tolling of a church bell punctuated conversations on the street, while factory whistles and the creak of wagon wheels added layers to the city's rhythm. On Front Street, merchants displayed bolts of cloth, fresh produce, and hand-forged tools vibrant with color. Yet in the shadow of these storefronts, whispers of unrest circulated, words barely spoken, rumors of a race problem threading through the taverns and parlors. Fact layer. Political tension was high as white supremacist groups were actively organizing to reclaim control of local government, fearing the growing influence of black voters and elected officials. Folklore layer WPA interviews decades later recounted that some residents felt an intangible presence, a warning carried on the wind, murmuring through the shutters of homes. Walk down Market Street. The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the tang of river water. Children laughed, chasing one another past the blacksmith and the tailor. Fact layer Wilmington had a strong black middle-class business owners, teachers, ministers, and craftsmen, forming a network that kept the community vibrant. Yet beyond the facades, threats lingered, letters burned before they reached their recipients, whispers carried in the night. Folklore layer, some remembered seeing figures in white robes at dusk, spirits of ancestors walking unseen, warning families of what was to come. The docks were alive. Stevedores loading cargo, sailors shouting instructions, the river reflecting the fading sun like molten bronze. Fact layer, Wilmington's port was crucial for trade, and the black community had stakes in commerce, owning warehouses and small businesses along the waterfront. Folklore layer legends told that on foggy nights, phantom ships drifted silently down the river, carrying those who had vanished, their cries mingling with the lapping water. Education thrived. Schools filled with the voices of children reciting lessons, learning to read, to write, to claim a place in a society that sought to deny them. Fact layer. The city had several schools funded and operated by the black community, offering hope and literacy amidst systemic oppression. Folklore layer parents whispered to their children of protective spirits watching over them, especially when fear seeped in from rumors of approaching violence. The homes themselves told stories. Clapboard houses painted in shades of blue-green and ochre porches lined with rocking chairs, flowers spilling over window boxes. Fact layer, many were modest, yet proud, constructed and maintained by families who had invested sweat and skill into their properties. The streets were mapped not just with addresses, but with memories of ancestors, footsteps echoing generations past. Folklore layer. It was said that when a home was threatened, spirits gathered in the corners unseen, eyes observing, ready to bear witness. At night, Wilmington changed. Lanterns flickered in windows, gaslights along the streets threw long shadows, and the city's heartbeat slowed to a cautious pulse. Fact layer, white supremacist militias were mobilizing, and rumors of impending violence circulated quietly but urgently. Political rhetoric inflamed tensions, stoking fear and suspicion. Folklore layer locals spoke of the night winds, a presence that carried both warning and foreboding, as if the city itself knew what was to come. The marketplace grew silent. Merchants shuttered their shops earlier than usual, families kept children close, and the rhythm of daily life took on a hushed tone. Fact layer documents from the period show meetings of city officials and militia members plotting the removal of black leaders from office, erasing the political power of the community. Folklore layer WPA narratives remembered lanterns floating down streets where businesses once thrived, ghostly markers of what had been taken, and yet life persisted. Church bells still tolled for evening prayer, families gathered for supper, and the laughter of children occasionally pierced the tension. Fact layer, the resilience of Wilmington's black community was evident in continued cultural life, music, storytelling, religious observances. Despite looming threats, the city remained vibrant and alive. Folklore layer elders told of invisible guardians walking beside children and adults alike, holding the threads of memory, ensuring that even if the town fell, its spirit would endure. Even the air seemed heavy with expectation. Smoke from chimneys mingled with mist rising from the river, carrying whispers that some would interpret as omens. Fact-layer political rallies and newspaper editorials indicated an approaching confrontation, while families prepared as best they could for what the night might bring. Folklore-layer tales circulated of a shadowy procession, a parade of souls moving silently, warning of destruction, yet offering guidance to those who listened. Every alley, every porch, every corner held stories. Some told aloud, others carried silently in the heart. Fact-layer census. Records, property deeds, and city maps documented the vibrancy of the Black population, their businesses, their homes, their churches. Folklore. Layer ghost stories told of children who disappeared only to reappear in dreams of elders whose voices carried warnings through generations. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Wilmington seemed to hold its breath. The city at once alive and trembling. Fact-layer historical accounts confirm the mounting fear, the strategic planning, the palpable tension between communities. Folklore. Layer locals later recounted a silence that seemed to hum with unseen presence, as though the city itself knew the devastation that awaited. This is the Wilmington of November 1898. A city standing at the threshold of loss and endurance. A place where every street, every building, every life was interwoven with stories of courage, threat, and hope. Fact-layer, the stage was set, the players in position, and history was poised to leave its indelible mark. Folklore-layer, yet whispers, said that even if buildings fell, even if lives were lost, the spirits of the community would remain watching, waiting, remembering. The morning after, Wilmington awoke to a silence that pressed against the ears. Fact-layer newspapers reported scattered fires, broken windows, businesses looted, yet no names listed, no numbers counted. Streets that had been alive with commerce now echoed with the steps of those fleeing carrying what they could. A chest of clothing, a bundle of papers, a child in trembling arms. Folklore-layer, decades later, WPA interviews spoke of lanterns that floated above the rooftops on that night, guiding the lost, or perhaps marking the passage of those who would never return. Alex Manley's office once humming with typewriters, and conversations stood empty. The Daily Record silenced its presses cold. Fact-layer. Manley had published editorials challenging white supremacy, and the backlash had been swift, organized, merciless. Pamphlets, letters, and warnings circulated demanding compliance, obedience, and silence. Folklore-layer. Some locals later claimed they could hear the ghostly rhythm of the printing press at midnight, as if the words never fully disappeared, pressing the truth into the night air. Homes along Market Street bore the scars of anger. Shutters splintered, doors ajar, rooms emptied. Fact-layer property deeds later recorded the sudden abandonment, families fleeing with little but hope and memories. Freedmen's Bureau documents referred to them vaguely as persons of unknown location, a phrase that swallowed their existence in the official record. Folklore-layer elders spoke of shadows moving within the homes, carrying with them the voices of those displaced, the laughter of children, and whispers of parents still lingering. The Black churches, pillars of the community, steeples casting long evening shadows over empty streets. Fact-layer congregations were scattered registers, destroyed or lost, and ministers recorded only fragments of sermons and attendance. The spiritual backbone of Wilmington had been fractured in a single night. Folklore-layer, it was said that hymns could still be heard carried by the wind, faint yet unmistakable. A chorus that lingered in the minds of survivors, echoing across decades. In the marketplaces, vendors abandoned their wares. Fabrics lay in tatters, fruit bruised and rotting, tools left in the dust. Fact-layer merchants documented losses as vast, impossible to quantify. Insurance claims denied aid, slow to arrive. Folklore-layer children later described seeing phantom figures returning to the streets, walking as if to reclaim what had been taken, their steps silent but deliberate. Letters and newspapers disappeared. Correspondence burned, archives ransacked. Fact-layer historians piecing together Wilmington's black community relied on fragments reports scattered across libraries, private collections, and surviving Freedmen's Bureau records. Names mentioned only once, stories incomplete, dates uncertain. Folklore. Layer locals remembered whispers, passing stories of spirits who carried letters to the river, releasing them into the current, letting them drift into eternity. Families hid in attics and cellars. Children clinging to mothers, husbands shielding wives, neighbors helping each other into shadows. Fact-layer police and militia accounts mention incidents of unrest, coded language that minimized the scale of the violence, masking massacres as riots. Photographic evidence sparse, censored, destroyed. Folklore. Layer elders spoke of a wind that howled through Wilmington that night, moving silently between houses, carrying prayers and warnings, as if the town itself breathed in mourning. The schools filled only hours before with voices learning letters and numbers. Lay empty benches overturned. Fact-layer educational records were incomplete, teachers' logs missing, and some children never returned to classrooms. Folklore-layer WPA interviews recounted that at dusk, spectral figures would appear in empty classrooms, chalk in hand, teaching lessons to invisible students, a reminder of knowledge, interrupted stories, unfinished. At the docks, the river reflected the orange glow of fires. Boats abandoned cargo, scattered, sailors and dock workers fled into the night. Fact-layer. Wilmington's port, once a hub of economic activity, saw black-owned warehouses damaged or seized livelihoods obliterated. Folklore. Layer fishermen claimed that lanterns moved along the water that night, guiding the spirits of those lost back to shore or into the unknown currents beyond. Letters smuggled out of Wilmington tell of terror. Accounts of neighbors disappearing, homes looted, families fleeing into the woods or onto riverboats. Fact-layer official dispatches report only a fraction of the truth, citing civil disturbances and property damage, avoiding the magnitude of death and displacement. Folklore. Layer locals remembered stories of invisible footsteps, following those who escaped, guiding them toward safety, or sometimes deeper into the dark woods. Even the streets that remained intact bore the marks of fear. Doors bolted, windows shuttered, the usual clamor replaced by cautious silence. Fact-layer political power was stripped from the black community. City council and mayoral offices were seized by white supremacists in the aftermath. Folklore-layer whispers of shadowy figures patrolling the streets circulated among those brave enough to stay, some claiming to hear distant drums in the night, echoing the rhythms of lost ancestors. The marketplace, the church, the homes, the docks, all told the same story. Fact-layer, Wilmington's black community had been targeted, displaced, and in many ways erased from official memory. Letters, photographs, ledgers, all vanished, leaving only fragments of existence. Folklore. Layer ghost stories filled the void. Oral traditions keeping alive the memory of what once was. Stories of children appearing at windows, of voices calling across empty streets, of shadows marking where lives had been, and yet resilience threaded through the remnants. Neighbors helped one another, families regrouped where they could, ministers and teachers sought to preserve what remained. Fact-layer community organizations attempted to document losses, to register the missing, to reclaim some semblance of continuity. Folklore. Layer stories spoke of protective spirits, walking among the survivors, unseen but palpable, carrying the strength and courage of those who refused to be forgotten. Even the wind seemed heavy with the memory of that night, carrying the scent of smoke, dust, river water, and tears. Fact-layer historians later pieced together events using newspaper fragments, Freedmen's Bureau reports, letters, and oral testimony. Folklore-layer. The wind was said to carry voices, guiding descendants to remember, to mourn, to learn, and to bear witness. Through every street, every home, every whispered story, Wilmington's black community left an imprint, that could not be erased. Fact layer, economic, social, and political records tell part of the story, but folklore fills the gaps. Folklore layer, ghost stories, dream narratives, ancestral warnings. These became the living memory of a people intertwining with the city itself. By nightfall, the city was both empty and alive. Firelight and shadows danced together across bricks and timber. Fact layer, contemporary accounts confirmed evacuation, destruction, and deaths. Yet numbers remained uncertain, names lost. Folklore layer, witnesses later described lanterns floating silently along streets and riverways, guiding souls, marking paths, signaling presence. And so the first chapter closes, not with endings, but with echoes. Fact layer, Wilmington's historical footprint shows a community disrupted its presence, challenged its contributions, minimized. Folklore layer, yet the whispers, the shadows, the spirits persist, carrying stories across time, waiting for ears willing to hear, for voices willing to recount. The night deepened over Wilmington. Streets that had once thrummed with life fell silent, save for the distant howl of wind and the occasional creak of a shutter swinging in the breeze. Fact layer official reports later documented sporadic gunfire, buildings set ablaze, families fleeing into the shadows. Yet names, numbers, and full accounts were largely erased, leaving only fragments for historians to piece together. Folklore layer locals would later tell of spectral flames dancing along empty streets, phantom fires that burned houses that had already crumbled, warning those who dared to linger. Children huddled in corners of homes, clutching the hands of mothers, whose eyes darted to every sound. Fathers whispered prayers under their breath, praying for protection, praying for safety, praying for dawn. Fact layer witnesses described families fleeing through alleys, riverbanks, and wooded areas, some carrying only what they could hold. Merchants and teachers abandoned livelihoods, documents, and cherished possessions. Folklore layer stories emerged of children seeing shadowy figures leading them through the mist, guiding them to temporary safety, or perhaps drawing them deeper into uncertainty. On the riverfront, small boats were hastily loaded. Cargo scattered, nets, abandoned lanterns, rocking in the water. Fact layer, Wilmington's black-owned port businesses were damaged or destroyed. Warehouses looted, river traffic disrupted. Records show that some families used these boats to escape upriver, their fates marked in reports only as unknown or fate uncertain. Folklore layer tales persisted of lanterns floating silently along the river, carrying the echoes of those who had vanished, their voices blending with the lapping water. In the churches, ministers tried to gather congregations to calm fear, to maintain hope. Hymns rose shakily from trembling lips, yet the sound carried an undercurrent of dread. Fact layer church registers were destroyed. Some records burned deliberately. The spiritual life of the city was under siege as white supremacist mobs sought to erase the presence of a thriving community. Folklore layer locals would later describe seeing ghostly congregations, shadows of worshipers frozen in place, their songs lingering long after the bells had stopped. Families moved silently through alleys. Baskets balanced on heads, children's hands tightly held the air thick with smoke and the scent of burned timber. Fact layer eyewitnesses reported mobs patrolling streets, targeting homes with black residents, forcing evacuation. Militia accounts later minimized these actions as civil disturbances, ignoring the scope of the violence. Folklore layer WPA narratives described shadows moving along the walls, carrying whispers of guidance and warning unseen guardians, navigating the city under moonlight. A young mother clutching her infant stumbled through the mist, every step echoing on cobblestones, every heartbeat hammering in her chest. Fact layer personal accounts, smuggled letters, and surviving diaries reveal the terror experienced by those attempting escape. Many families became separated, children lost to the night, adults vanished without a trace. Folklore layer stories spoke of phantom hands appearing to lead them forward, of voices softly repeating names, urging persistence, and guiding through confusion. On the outskirts, fires burned brightly against the darkened sky. Chimneys toppled, fences collapsed, belongings charred beyond recognition. Fact layer insurance claims, when submitted, were denied, and property damage was never fully compensated. Many businesses, homes, and community institutions were lost forever. Folklore. Layer eyewitnesses decades later claimed that flames appeared again in visions, a memory that burned as brightly as the night itself, etching the trauma into collective consciousness. The black schoolhouse, normally filled with the sound of learning, sat abandoned. Desks, overturned chalkboards, scarred books scattered in the dirt. Fact layer teachers' logs were missing, attendance records gone, some students never returned. The educational foundation of Wilmington's black community had been violently disrupted. Folklore. Layer children remembered seeing spectral teachers in empty classrooms, chalk in hand, continuing lessons for unseen students, a haunting persistence of knowledge interrupted. On the main avenue, merchants' stalls were empty. Fruits, bruised, fabrics torn, handmade wares trampled into the mud. Fact layer, Wilmington's black-owned commercial sector faced devastation. The economic network disrupted. Ledgers and account books vanished, erasing years of commerce. Folklore. Layer neighbors later spoke of shadows returning to sweep up goods as if to reclaim what had been lost. Invisible hands working through the ruins. In the midst of chaos, whispers carried along the streets. Rumors of disappearances, of families gone, of neighbors never seen again. Fact layer contemporary letters describe these evacuations. Yet official records fail to account for the missing, the dead, the displaced, a deliberate erasure from history. Folklore layer. These whispers became the basis for ghost stories carried from one generation to the next, warning of what had occurred and reminding the living that injustice leaves echoes. At the docks, families crowded onto small boats. Oars cutting through the fog, the river reflecting the orange glow of distant fires. Fact layer, some successfully escaped upriver. Others were lost along the way, their names never officially recorded. Folklore layer lanterns floated ahead, a spectral guide through the fog, illuminating paths to safety, or perhaps to unknown destinies. Meanwhile, in the city center, men attempted to organize resistance. Makeshift barricades, whispered plans, hurried messages sent from safe houses. Fact layer reports mention minor skirmishes, the presence of militia, the breakdown of law enforcement favoring white supremacist forces. Folklore. Layer shadows were said to move independently of the living, guiding, protecting, sometimes warning, a silent witness to courage and despair alike. Even pets and livestock were caught in the upheaval. Dogs yelped in alleys, horses bolted from stables, the city's animals scattering into night. Fact layer property records and farm logs later described the loss of livestock and materials vital to survival. Folklore. Layer locals recounted that the animals themselves seemed guided by unseen forces, moving with purpose through the chaos, sometimes leading humans to safety. As the hours dragged on, Wilmington became a city suspended between worlds. The living fleeing, the dead remembered, and the unseen walking the streets. Fact layer censuses, property records, and newspaper reports offer glimpses, but cannot capture the breadth of suffering and courage. Folklore. Layer ghosts were said to patrol the abandoned avenues, moving in and out of sight, whispering names, marking places where lives had been irrevocably altered. A family hid in a cellar. Mother humming a hymn softly. Father gripping a rifle, children pressed to their sides. Fact layer militia patrols were thorough homes, searched families displaced. The night was alive with fear and vigilance. Folklore layer shadows crept across walls, soft whispers providing courage, guiding the hidden toward a safer path, a promise of continuity beyond the night. By dawn, Wilmington streets were littered with the remnants of life disrupted. Burnt timbers, broken furniture, scattered clothing. Fact. Layer official surveys recorded destruction, but survivors' stories remained fragmented. Whole communities uprooted, lives lost, and the fabric of a city torn. Folklore. Layer. It is said that when the sun rose, ghostly figures lingered, marking the paths of those who had fled, echoing the stories of courage, survival, and unresolved grief. Even as survivors began to return cautiously, the streets were different, the air heavy, the shadows longer. Fact layer, many found homes, gone businesses, seized institutions, dismantled. Rebuilding was slow, tentative, constrained by the weight of systemic oppression. Folklore. Layer whispers of lanterns floating along empty streets persisted, guiding those who would stay, warning, reminding, haunting. And so the night of Wilmington passed, not with finality, but with echoes that would ripple through generations. Fact layer. The immediate violence subsided, but displacement, trauma, and erasure remained. Folklore. Layer spirits continued to traverse the city, watching, waiting, reminding the living of the lives and communities that had been torn apart. The people who survived carried stories in their hearts, tales of bravery, loss, cunning, and endurance. Fact layer. These stories, pieced together from letters, diaries, and interviews, form the backbone of historical understanding. Folklore layer, yet whispers of ghostly processions, lanterns, and shadowed figures preserve the emotional truth, the psychic landscape of a night when Wilmington's black community faced annihilation. The city remained, but the city had changed. Brick and timber scarred memories, carried by those who lived, whispered through generations. Fact layer maps, censuses, and court records would only hint at the scale of what occurred. Folklore. Layer lanterns still floated in collective memory, shadows still haunted the streets, and voices of the lost echoed in the night air, refusing to be silenced. The morning sun rose over Wilmington, a pale light filtering through smoke and haze, illuminating streets still scarred by fire and fear. Fact layer city records indicate the aftermath of the massacre: homes destroyed, businesses looted, families displaced. The census, fragmented and incomplete, barely captures the scale of loss. Names crossed out, addresses abandoned, lives reduced to fragments. Folklore layer locals later recounted that lanterns appeared along the streets at dawn, floating without holders, as though the souls of those lost were retracing the steps of their last night. Maps created after the violence show the reorganization of the city. Neighborhoods once thriving now empty or repurposed under new ownership. Fact layer. Black-owned businesses seized properties, redistributed political offices reclaimed by white supremacist forces. Archival documents describe administrative changes, but omit the human toll. Folklore. Layer elders would speak of ghostly merchants returning to empty stalls, arranging goods as if to preserve dignity, to mark a history the world refused to remember. Families attempted to rebuild gathering scattered belongings. Children clutching remnants of toys, parents searching through charred wood and twisted metal. Fact layer Freedmen's Bureau reports indicate temporary aid shelters and petitions for restitution. Yet resources were minimal, insufficient to restore livelihoods. Folklore. Layer stories persisted of spirits guiding survivors to hidden caches of supplies, whispered directions in the night that could save a life or perhaps protect a fragment of memory. In churches, ministers convened gatherings, speaking softly, encouraging resilience, teaching faith in the face of destruction. Fact layer registers were reconstructed where possible, schools reopened. Sporadically, community organizations tried to document losses. Yet gaps remained, lives erased from official recognition. Folklore. Layer children recalled shadows lingering in pews, shapes bending to touch an empty space, their presence a silent lesson, a reminder that what is lost may yet linger in spirit. Letters, diaries, and scattered newspapers offered glimpses, stories of neighbors, friends, families. Fact layer, the Wilmington Daily Record, had been destroyed. Presses silenced, archives lost. Surviving copies are scarce. Accounts written in haste, sent secretly, or remembered orally, provide fragmented but crucial testimony. Folklore layer whispers of voices carried on the wind, reciting names, dates, deeds, as though the town itself refused to forget. Dreams became a currency of memory. Survivors reported visions of those lost, just appearing to them, in sleep or twilight, carrying messages of warning or comfort. Fact layer. WPA interviews decades later captured these narratives. Dreams were intertwined with reality, guiding behavior, documenting fears, reinforcing bonds. Folklore. Layer spirits were said to appear near riverbanks or in abandoned homes, walking alongside the living, reminding them of what had been stolen and what must be preserved. The schools attempted to resume normalcy. Chalkboards, clean desks, rearranged children returning under wary eyes. Fact layer, some classrooms reopened months later, teachers risking threats to educate to preserve literacy and culture, yet gaps remained in records, in memory, in continuity. Folklore. Layer students recalled spectral figures standing at windows, invisible hands guiding letters, silently correcting mistakes, keeping alive the continuity of learning in the face of absence. Even the streets bore witness. The echoes of hurried footsteps, the creak of shutters, the soft whispers of those who returned. Fact layer property deeds and city maps show which buildings remained, which were demolished, which were reallocated. Legal documentation attempted to codify the aftermath. Yet omissions were deliberate erasures sanctioned. Folklore. Layer WPA narratives describe shadows walking along deserted streets, touching doors, leaving invisible marks that signaled memory, presence, persistence. Riverside neighborhoods struggled. Families navigating flooded streets, debris blocking paths, the smell of burnt timber mingling with the river's scent. Fact layer economic activity severely disrupted. Warehouses destroyed trade, halted livelihoods imperiled. Surviving correspondence documents the attempts of families to salvage goods, seek aid, or relocate entirely. Folklore layer local legend held that at night, spectral figures guided lost travelers along the river, lanterns, bobbing shadows pointing the way, ensuring that the memory of their home was carried forward. Political power had been stripped. City council, mayoral offices, law enforcement now entirely under white supremacist control. Fact layer. Black voters, previously a majority, disenfranchised through intimidation and violence. Petitions for redress ignored. Folklore layer. The spirits of those who had voted, marched, and fought for recognition were said to haunt the council chambers, their silent protest echoing through history. On the edges of the city, the river reflected the bloodied skies of smoke and flame. Small boats drifting abandoned or carrying those lucky enough to escape. Fact layer property records indicate Black-owned docks and warehouses seized or burned. River traffic disrupted, commerce interrupted. Folklore. Layer legends describe ghostly oarsmen silently paddling in the night, guiding those displaced, offering hope or perhaps warning. In homes, survivors whispered to each other, recounting experiences, teaching lessons to the next generation, passing along memory. Fact layer, private letters, diaries, and oral histories preserve fragmented accounts, names, events, moments of courage. Folklore. Layer ghosts were said to appear in corners of homes, sometimes comforting, sometimes silent witnesses, keeping the emotional truth alive when documentation failed. Even animals seemed aware. Horses, restless dogs, whining livestock scattering. Fact layer farm records and property logs confirm losses. Livelihoods destroyed along with homes. Folklore layer pets and beasts were remembered as guided by invisible hands, moving instinctively, protecting, marking safe paths. Stories circulated of midnight processions, invisible figures moving along streets, following paths of escape or loss. Fact layer historians reconstruct these movements using scattered eyewitness accounts, letters, and newspaper fragments. Folklore layer lanterns floating silently, marking routes, shadows protecting the living spirits, mourning the dead. By dusk, Wilmington's black community had endured. Some families found shelter, others remained in hiding. Many lost forever. Fact layer census records and property surveys offer glimpses, but vast gaps remain. Folklore. Layer whispers, lanterns, shadows, dreams. These became the living memory carrying truth beyond official documentation, preserving courage, grief, and resilience. And so even amid destruction, fact, layer property seized lives, uprooted institutions, dismantled. Folklore, layer spirits continued to watch, to guide, to remind. The echoes of 1898 would ripple through generations, shaping stories, culture, and memory, ensuring that though the town had been attacked, it would never be entirely erased. The legacy of that night, etched in both record and legend, remained. The streets, the river, the homes, the churches. Fact, layer documentation provides incomplete evidence, snapshots of loss and resilience. Folklore, layer ghost stories, dream narratives, whispered warnings, preserve the emotional and spiritual truth, the heart of a community that refused to vanish completely. The city of Wilmington had settled into a deceptive quiet, the echoes of the previous nights still reverberating through empty streets. Fact layer documents indicate that city records, council minutes, and property deeds were either missing or deliberately altered. Names crossed out, families erased evidence of what transpired, disappearing into obscurity. Folklore layer locals whispered that the streets themselves remembered, that shadows lingered long after the living had fled, moving silently, keeping watch over what had been lost. In the remnants of burned homes, investigators found charred papers, fragments of letters, torn ledgers, each scrap a ghost of a life once fully realized. Fact layer, these fragments hint at the scale of destruction, small businesses, churches, schools, lives uprooted, and livelihoods obliterated. Official reports minimize the events, labeling them disturbances, downplaying the systematic displacement. Folklore, layer elder storytellers claimed that the wind carried voices across the ruins, repeating names, recalling faces, as if the city refused to allow them to vanish entirely. Alex Manley's office had become a symbol of both courage and erasure. Typewriters, cold presses, silent manuscripts smudged and abandoned. Fact layer, Manley's editorials had challenged white supremacy, and the response had been swift, violent, and unrecorded fully. Letters survived only in fragments, testimonies smuggled out of the city. Folklore, layer, some spoke of hearing the rhythmic tapping of invisible keys at midnight, the echo of words that refused to be silenced, shaping memory where records failed. Families searched for what remained. Clothing, charred furnishings, ruined valuables, gone. Fact layer property assessments made in the aftermath, record losses, but fail to account for human suffering. Financial compensation was largely denied or delayed. Folklore, layer locals later recounted spectral hands unseen, but felt gathering scattered possessions, leading children and elders through ruins, a protective presence in the chaos. Even the river seemed to mourn, the water dark and slow, reflecting the sky like ink, carrying the scent of smoke and ash. Fact layer, eyewitness accounts mentioned families boarding small boats to escape upriver, their fates often listed as unknown in later reports. Commercial docks, warehouses, and warehouses once managed by black families were seized or burned. Folklore layer tales persisted of lanterns gliding across the water, guiding the lost or signaling paths taken by those spirits still tethered to their homes. Amidst the debris, survivors recounted nights of terror. Bullets, whizzing flames licking the edges of buildings, mobs patrolling alleys. Fact layer, Friedman's Bureau records and local correspondence indicate attempts to provide shelter and aid, though these were fragmented and insufficient. Folklore, layer shadows moved between houses, sometimes leading the frightened, sometimes warning, sometimes simply observing the city itself, becoming a participant in its own haunting. In the churches, ministers attempted to maintain structure. Hymns sung softly, candles flickering in drafty rooms, voices trembling. Fact layer registers were incomplete, attendance inconsistent, some congregants never returned. Schools struggled to reopen, teachers risked threats to continue instruction. Folklore layer, Some elders remembered spectral congregants, chairs rocking on their own voices, lifting prayers long after the bell had fallen silent. Political halls, once sites of debate and governance, now stood as silent monuments. Offices emptied, records manipulated, the balance of power violently shifted. Fact layer. Black officials removed offices seized by white supremacist militias. Petitions ignored, community representation erased. Folklore. Layer. Ghostly echoes of debates past were said to drift through hallways, voices arguing points that would never reach ears in the physical world. On the outskirts, families navigated the ruins, seeking refuge. Children clutching mothers' hands, fathers shielding them from both sight and memory. Fact layer. Census records, post-event show massive displacement properties, abandoned communities fragmented. Folklore layer. Whispers told of protective spirits appearing along pathways, leading those who remained through the mist, ensuring survival where the living could no longer intervene. Even pets and livestock carried the imprint of chaos. Horses bolting, dogs yelping, chickens scattered. Fact layer. Farm logs confirm loss of animals critical to sustenance. Economic devastation compounded human suffering. Folklore layer. Locals later claimed animals moved under guidance of unseen forces, instinctively avoiding danger, leading owners to safety. Letters hidden in drawers, smuggled out by friends, became threads connecting the past. Fragments of testimonies, torn pieces of identity. Fact layer. Archival efforts decades later relied on these scraps to reconstruct the sequence of events, the scale of displacement, and the human cost. Folklore layer. Whispered stories describe lanterns floating down streets and rivers, carrying messages, memories, warnings, a spectral archive resistant to human neglect. By nightfall, the city held its breath. Shadows lengthened, moonlight pale and watchful. Fact layer. Militia movements documented in fragmented police reports. Few corroborated, many exaggerated or suppressed. Survivors recounting events decades later filled in the narrative gaps. Folklore layer. Ghostly figures were said to patrol streets, moving silently between blocks, hovering near churches and schools, ensuring memory persisted where record could not. Even as survivors began tentative reconstruction, broken streets, ruins of homes, shattered windows, fact layer. Property deeds and maps show neighborhoods altered forever, with black-owned spaces diminished or destroyed. Folklore layer. Whispers of lanterns continuing to float, guiding descendants to ancestral sites, reminding them that though history had attempted erasure, memory remained intact in spirit. The climax of Wilmington's night was not a single act, but a layering of fear, violence, and resilience. Fact layer. Official documentation provides glimpses, the exact count of dead unknown families, displaced, unrecorded properties seized. Folklore layer. Spectral processions, shadowed figures, unseen protectors. They persisted, imprinting Wilmington's streets with memory that no official report could fully convey. The city's heartbeat slowed, but it did not stop. Survivors carrying stories, whispering warnings, passing knowledge to children. Fact layer. Letters, diaries, and fragmented newspaper clippings attempted to preserve reality. Folklore layer. Shadows and lanterns, unseen yet undeniable, ensuring that the essence of what occurred could never be fully extinguished. And as the first light of dawn attempted to pierce smoke and fog, Wilmington stood scarred but present. Fact layer. The community had endured. Records remained fragmented, history threatened yet alive. Folklore layer. The spirits lingered, watching, guarding, whispering, a bridge between what was lost and what must be remembered. The night had passed, but its echoes persisted. Each alley, porch, riverbank, schoolhouse, church, all carrying residue of fear, courage, sorrow, and resilience. Fact layer. Historians rely on fragments, reports, letters, oral histories to reconstruct the events. Folklore layer. Whispers of lanterns, shadowed figures, ghostly footsteps, carrying memory forward, reminding the living that erasure can be challenged if only one listens. This is Wilmington, 1898. A city marked by violence, resilience, and the persistent presence of memory. Shadows walking alongside the living lanterns, floating over empty streets, whispers threading between fact and folklore. The morning after the storm. Wilmington awoke to streets quiet, yet laden with memory. Fact layer homes and businesses destroyed records. Incomplete families dispersed. The census reflected empty spaces, schools and churches abandoned, communities fragmented. Folklore. Layer elders whispered of spirits wandering, moving silently along streets, touching doors, hovering near windows, marking the lives that had been lost, guarding what remained. Time passed, yet the echoes never faded. Neighborhoods rebuilt, streets repaved, commerce resumed. Fact, layer economic recovery was uneven. Black-owned properties reclaimed slowly, if at all. Political structures remained dominated by those who had seized power in 1898. Folklore. Layer local legends persisted, lanterns floating at twilight, shadowed figures glimpsed from corners, voices murmuring warnings to those who would listen. Children who survived grew into adults, carrying memories of that night in their hearts, stories of courage, terror, and displacement shaping their sense of identity. Fact, layer oral histories collected decades later by the WPA reveal fragmented recollections, names, locations, events, pieces of a puzzle partially lost to time. Folklore. Layer dreams, recounted to grandchildren, spoke of ghostly figures, protective spirits, and lingering presences that ensured memory survived the erasure of records. Even as generations moved on, the river, the streets, the churches, the schoolhouses held traces of history. Fact layer archival research reveals property disputes, unresolved families whose names vanish from public record, communities that struggled to reclaim their legacy. Historical accounts are incomplete, often sanitized, yet fragments remain. Folklore. Layer whispers persisted of spectral gatherings of lanterns floating above streets at night, of voices calling names long forgotten, keeping alive the essence of what was nearly erased. Music carried memory through the decades. Spirituals sung quietly in homes, melodies haunting and enduring. Fact layer recordings and transcriptions from later historians capture fragments of these songs, offering insight into resilience and sorrow. Folklore. Layer legend held that the spirits of those lost still sang along with the living, their voices threading through the community's memory, guiding descendants and preserving the pulse of history. Historians pieced together fragments, letters, diaries, census records, newspaper clippings. Fact layer evidence reconstructed the scale of destruction, the displacement of families, the erasure of political and economic influence. Yet gaps remained voids, where lives and events disappeared without record. Folklore. Layer oral traditions filled these voids, recounting ghostly processions, lanterns drifting along streets, shadows protecting and marking the paths of the displaced. The town itself became a memory, a city alive yet haunted by what had transpired. Fact layer physical traces remained: charred foundations, altered streetscapes, repurposed buildings. The surviving records only hint at the scale of the events. Folklore. Layer locals spoke of ghostly echoes in the streets, of whispers moving through empty rooms, of the presence of ancestors guiding the living, keeping watch over the history that almost vanished. Visitors walking the streets years later felt a heaviness, a pause in the wind, a quiet that was more than absence. Fact layer historians and researchers recorded oral histories, cross-referenced archival documents, yet much remained inaccessible, lost. Folklore. Layer tales told of shadowy figures at dusk, of lanterns bobbing along riverbanks, of soft voices reciting names, a bridge between memory and history, between what was documented and what lived in spirit. Even today, the echoes linger. Fact layer Wilmington's Black community left indelible marks, cultural, economic, political. Though some spaces were lost, others reclaimed. Folklore. Layer's spirits are said to remain not in malevolence, but as custodians of memory, reminding the living of resilience, courage, and the refusal to be forgotten. Historians, descendants, and visitors alike walk these streets, reading plaques, viewing reconstructed buildings, piecing together fragments of a story once nearly erased. Fact layer: the scale of what occurred in 1898 is increasingly recognized. Yet many names, lives, and stories remain unrecorded. Folklore: layer ghost stories continue to circulate, teaching lessons of vigilance, remembrance, and the persistence of memories. The river continues to flow, carrying whispers, memories, and fragments of voices long silenced. Fact layer: economic activity, port operations, and city life resumed over decades. Yet the shadow of the past remained. Folklore: layer lanterns said to drift across water at night, floating in remembrance, guiding descendants to reflect, to honor, to witness. And as the sun sets, Wilmington holds its secrets. Fact layer: historical documentation can never fully capture the human experience, the terror, the courage, the displacement. Folklore layer: the spiritual memory of the community endures, echoing in songs, stories, dreams, and whispers, bridging generations. The night, the streets, the homes, the river, all carry the residue of 1898. Fact layer lives: uprooted institutions, destroyed communities, displaced. Folklore layer: yet ghosts linger, gentle, persistent, watchful, a reminder that even when history attempts to erase, memory persists. And so we leave Wilmington, not as it was, nor as it is, but as it must be remembered. Fact layer: fragments of evidence, letters, diaries, newspapers, archival research. Folklore layer: lanterns, drifting shadows, moving whispers, lingering. A city that refuses to be forgotten. You have just heard a story from history that was never fully closed. The echoes of Wilmington, 1898, remain in streets, in songs, in whispers. Follow, listen, and bear witness, so that the voices of those nearly erased may continue to be heard.